Finding the remains of Cyborg, a scientist decides to resurrect it, and turns out that there's more to the story than meets the eye. And that's of course the basic story of Alita, Battle Angel. I'm just saying Dan Edmonds.
Hello.
And yeah, we'll talking during the Memorial Day weekend, which is kind of, a lot of times, mostly on this show, we talk about the fallen fictional characters and stuff, but it's this weekend we'll be remembering a little bit of honoring the true warriors that have fallen. It's also, of course, the weekend that Top Gun has taken off and to quite acclaim. So I thought that this time around, the thing that came to my mind was what is it that kind of separates between we've kind of talked about this different ways between like fan service and pandering to like things where we're basically, that's more organic, I guess, to the story and stuff.
Yeah, well, that's often the thing. Hollywood tries to often mediate stuff away from the original source material, especially if it's more unusual. And it's a difficult one because obviously, as we've seen with various franchises, you can either get it right and please the fans. When you get it wrong, you get it horribly wrong, and you lose all their support overnight. So yeah, I think it's also the problem that if you stick incredibly closely to the source material, if it's say a comic or a manga, you do run the risk of just not making a very good movie, really.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely a fine balance. I think it's more the case that you have to perhaps re-engineer a plot, but try and keep as much of the original spirit and characters that made up, or what made them enjoyable characters in the first place, and whatever it was that you were trying to adapt. What are your thoughts?
Well, one of these times we're going to talk about the Psycho, original versus remake and stuff, because what they did was with the remake was a shot for shot, and it totally bombed. I mean, that's what's interesting, that you can actually just duplicate, but it won't have the same energy as the original and stuff. And I think that's sometimes what's interesting, is that like, the audiences will feel it, and like we just, I mean, we know when we're seeing something that's imitation versus something that like there's something to it. And going back a little bit to Top Gun, is that they could very well have done a lot of things that were very much almost like a remake of the original, or copied it and stuff, but they did a really fresh take on it, because there were things that honored it, and there's bordered on fan service and stuff, but for the most part there was just this kind of new energy to it that like you really, it's there's things that you expect it, and then it takes you to interesting places. And I think that's the thing that, like, with any kind of these remakes that we've talked about and stuff, the ones that take you to interesting places are the ones you kind of go, oh wow, I didn't expect that and stuff. And then that's usually something that delights us.
Yeah, it's something that gives you something fresh, but basically keeps it with the same kind of character. I'd say not an easy task, I don't think. I mean, and I would say with this, the remake did make quite a few changes and tried to sort of throw in quite a few new elements, but interestingly, not ones that I think were done intentionally to well, not completely to please audiences, but more to sort of find a more sort of thought-provoking ground a little bit. But anyway, we'll get into that. Yeah. So I mean, we watched the 1993 OVA, Battle Angel Alita, obviously written by Yukito Kushiro before that, and it's a very long-running manga. And I don't think they've ever done, I could be wrong, but I don't think they've done a long series sort of anime that covers the whole thing. But definitely the one that I know, and most people know if they have watched it, is these 1993 OVAs in 2 parts. Obviously, it probably condenses the story down quite a lot, but we're in sort of similar territory as Ghost in the Shell, and we've got a tough cyborg female who is sort of trying to navigate her way around this interesting dystopian world. And what
And
did you
this,
think? I was going to ask you, what did you think of the kind of world that he created with this?
the first thing, like the opening scene right away, like kind of brought to mind Wall-E. Like the
Yeah,
dystopia where like just garbage is dumped and stuff. And it's interesting that like Wall-E was what that was made like in was it in
2010s, I want to say
yeah
roughly something
yeah
like
so
that,
so many years
2013.
later.
Yeah.
And so I feel like they definitely kind of took notes from this vision and stuff.
Well,
And
yeah, that was one thing that got me.
okay.
This future world of garbage is pretty interesting as a concept. So, but yeah,
Mhm.
go on. What you were saying?
And I was going to say that like it makes you wonder also that like what is it about that idea that kind of has really stuck, like I think the obvious one of course is that like we do understand that like hey, we are really screwing up our environment if all we do is keep dumping and not like like thinking about the consequences and stuff. And like kind of I feel like at least something we've done one good shift is that we at least have moved the needle a little bit towards recycling and repurposing and that kind of thing, stuff like that. So we're not totally gone entirely yet,
Mm.
but at the same time I think it's like recognition that okay, like is it enough and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's obviously it's this idea of rampant consumerism that just stacks up over the
Mm-hmm.
decades. It's a very logical conclusion to come to that we would
Mm-hmm.
just be living in a massive world of rubbish eventually. But I mean, it's when you think about this was done probably in the late 80s, I guess the manga must have been written, and there's
Mm-hmm.
other movies like Elysium
Right, that was the other one that came
and
to mind.
yeah, and Wall-E is obviously the other one. But there's I actually looked at like what was the first another one that obviously came that sort of
Uh-huh.
blew my mind as a kid. But actually, you know what? This is before well, at least before the OVA of this. Maybe they read the manga, but of course, Transformers the movie actually
Huh.
has a whole planet of garbage where some of the robots actually come from. They kind of piece themselves
Huh.
together. So it'd be interesting to know. I'd have to look at the timeline a bit,
Uh-huh.
whether one influenced another or vice
Mm-hmm.
versa. I'm guessing this was, Transformers was probably influenced by this rather than the other way around.
Right.
But yeah, the first instance I could find of a sci-fi movie about like a world that's basically just turned to garbage through consumerism was Garbage World, which is a novel back in 1967. So
Doesn't get
this
more
must
on
have
the
been
nose than that.
no, it doesn't. But I think that's kind of when the beginning of a lot of this sort of environmental
Mm.
movements were starting
Mm-hmm.
up. So maybe that's where the
Yeah.
where it comes
Yeah,
from.
it
But
was
yeah,
around like I'd say like this around the 70s is like when we really started having a lot more, because that's when the EPA was actually founded as well. So it's around that time that like there was a lot more awareness of like the consequences of what harm we're doing to this environment. There was this iconic PSA with like this Indian, he has his tear and stuff like kind of
yes, I know
it,
that advert. Yeah.
okay. And that's like kind of that's something that like really has stuck with a lot of our like our generation's childhood, I think. And it's definitely kind of, I think that's one of the things that like even nowadays, as we kind of joke about, the woke kind of, generation, stuff like that. That's one thing I think they really do kind of have raised the awareness of and kind of really push for. It's like kind of, it's interesting how like that's much more of a theme for, you know, the quote unquote kids nowadays and stuff than ever before.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's funny because it's one of those things you can look at, and you can look at two sort of eventualities. One is where the garbage just piles up and we keep making
Mhm.
things, or one where we just run out of the raw materials, the resources to actually make
Mm,
things. So we've actually turned into this green pastoral sort of future where we don't really have much stuff as
right.
a result. But yeah, I think the other interesting thing about this is this theme of inequality,
Yes.
which was way ahead of its time, and is obviously much more obvious in Elysium, which I kind of see as like a
Mhm.
you know a Western Hollywood sort of remake of
Mm,
Alita in a way. But yeah, this idea that you have this sort of elite society
mhm.
that's just not even on the planet anymore; it's floating above it and just
Yeah,
dumps its trash back on. So yeah, that's a theme that we've seen a few times in a few other science fiction movies.
definitely. And it's interesting how strong these are. It's definitely um very much locked into this story and stuff. And yet like it's something that like clearly has resonated because like you said, there's all these other works that have kind of I don't know about copied it, but I've like kind of taken their notes from it. And the art style too, I thought was like very much kind of the in the realm of heavy metal. I think it's like
Mm.
that's another one that probably excuse me, have influenced each other and stuff. That both it resembles stuff that like from the heavy metal movies, and never mind like kind of the artwork from the their kind of magazines and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that I found really fascinating about this is this idea that it's one of the few. So you have sort of science fiction like RoboCop and other sort of science fiction about cyborgs, and they're often portrayed as the cyborg is probably it's like the first of its type, or you're seeing how they develop this new sort of superhero kind of killing machine that's a cyborg, or they're they're the antagonist, which is the cyborg and trying to attack people, and it's seen as a sort of borderline it's where nature meets machine, and it's like a crisis of of whether this is really ethically acceptable. And then this is we're projected into a future, 600 years into the future, where the idea of changing your body and augmenting it in any way is just a matter of fact, a daily a daily occurrence. There's no sort of prejudice or anything like that against well, there is, but it becomes it's very much an individual prejudice rather than a societal one, which is kind of interesting, in that you have people just swapping and chopping and changing bits of their body at the drop of a hat, and upgrading bits and and just becomes part of your existence there, which I thought was it's very rare to see that, a story that's set so far into the future where these things have are just a daily occurrence.
It's in some ways I feel like they are kind of really predicting something that seems like we are headed that way and stuff. Like certainly implants and like we're nowadays having a hip replacement or things like that, like are more second nature now. Like we I feel like different times when people have talked about it, it's usually a lot more matter of factly compared to like years ago, when it's like kind of like, oh, you're doing what and stuff like that. And, now it's like kind of like getting a hip replacement, kind of like almost like getting a tire changed or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's you can look at it in one of two ways. You can all sort of make the argument this is sort of body dysmorphia, and people just sort of like removed their minds are removed from what the reality of what their body is. But then the other argument you can make is that, well, these are people just sort of deciding to change bits themselves, and it's their own decision, and good luck with it. I mean, it's kind of we've talked about this a little bit in terms of Conan, and how that the images of the 80s, we suddenly started getting sort of massive bodybuilders, and fitness and body beautiful became like a cultural thing. And I mean, I think in a way it's body augmentation in a way is going to become an increasing sort of trend that we see more of. And it's there's some French guy who's basically, he's sort of sliced off a piece of it. He wants to look like an alien, basically. And he's sliced off a piece of his nose. He's had implants put in his head. He's had these two sort of fingers removed to make himself look like a sort of a three-fingered alien. And he's doing something else. I mean, it's really, pretty extreme.
Right.
But it's becoming more normal. And you could sort of say that, I mean, the fake natty phenomenon, which is people who take steroids and then sort of try to make out that they don't take steroids, and they become fitness gurus on Instagram and things like this, is it's people making, of course maybe they don't know, but it's the idea of, rather than physically adjusting your body, you're taking chemicals that will basically shorten your life, but will maybe make your part of your life at a higher, you'll be able to get more out of life at a younger age, perhaps, and a trade-off of longevity and things like this. So it's an interesting kind of trade-off we've made now, but it's much more common.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that it's this movie definitely is advanced and just kind of predicting that kind of world and stuff like that. I think that's something that I'm trying to remember whether we talk about it in Westworld so much. I don't feel like that's as, it's not so much that we talk about human replacement, as opposed to like, that basically taking our consciousness and kind of, that they're trying to, they're working on that idea and stuff. As I mentioned before, like, Upload is definitely like kind of where it's, they're very on the nose about that idea though, about like, taking our consciousness and, putting it somewhere else and stuff like that.
Yeah, I would say Westworld is more about compartmentalizing consciousness and experience and reality and time and things like that. So
Right.
yeah, but it's but I'm I mean I think that's maybe what was probably the reason for why it took so long to do a live action adaptation, because trying to do ad hoc body augmentation with cybernetic parts in great detail is not something that's going to be easy to represent realistically in real life.
Definitely.
But I mean, going back to the anime version of this, it's we have Dr. Ido, who is this sort of father figure to Alita. And to be honest with you, I don't know enough about the manga to know that whether Alita is some sort of Martian war machine that was sort of dug up and is 300 years old. I'm assuming that is correct, because I know James Cameron is pretty besotted with the with the manga.
But at least for the the versions we watch and stuff, which is basically the anime. I mean, it's not covered at all. Like kind of it's something that like if anything too, that like we don't really even see as much of a thing about it's kind of like Zombies is gold stuff, but I think it's like in as we'll see in the remake, they made it more of a antagonistic thing that like, okay, that's what we're really headed towards. But like we'll get to that discussion about how like we're spending time to get to that, I guess, and stuff. But yeah, like for this one,
I mean, I would say it's quite a simple story, really, the OVA, and it's kind of a coming of age story and a sort of tale of unrequited love and obsession, really, if I had to sort of put it in a, compress it, so to speak. But
it's I feel like it's really more of a Romeo and Juliet or West Side Story, of which at some point we'll talk about and stuff. That for the star-crossed lovers and everything, or star-crossed young lovers, and that's the thing that like we really see like kind of very much represented, is this kind of innocent love, versus like kind of in this anime version, there's this backdrop of like everything else is kind of corrupt, like kind of around them, because like in this one, Shiren, who's like kind of this former partner, I guess, of Dr. Ito, there's this kind of representation of this kind of like this kind of sleazy kind of romance going on with Vector, and it's kind of like this thing of like just that like in lust is kind of just basically just like a adjunct of ambition and getting what you want and stuff like that, and there isn't kind of any sign of like kind of like love in the sense of familial or otherwise and stuff.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it juxtaposes the sort of innocent love between Yugo and Alita with this world where people's bodies are literally dismembered. You don't have any. You don't have any. Yes. Everything is so corrupt that people sell and trade bits of their bodies, and you've got kids who are on the streets basically stealing people's spines and brains to sell them, and a little girl who has to go and sort of battle massive robots just to sort of earn her living. It's this. Yeah, I mean, it's a world where innocence and anything, any kind of sort of conventional sense of innocence and normal operation of society has completely gone by the wayside, and they're sort of non-physical, really, just as purely sort of emotional kind of connection is is something that really sort of stands out at the end of the movie.
Yeah, and visually it's represented by this kind of dark world that's kind of pretty similar to Ghost in the Shell and stuff, where I mean it's just kind of as we'll get into again with the remake, it's kind of very different in that aesthetic as well. And where you have like kind of just these young women that turn a corner and they can basically be assaulted and stuff. There's a sense of that, like it's a very much a nightmarish kind of I guess it's described as cyberpunk. I didn't think of it that way when I watched it and stuff, but I kind of see where that comes from, because cyberpunk we often associate with like kind of Blade Runner, kind of grainy slash dark cityscapes and stuff.
Yeah, but it's also something that's missing from the remake, as you said. It's like this idea that we begin almost in a similar kind of place as Ghost in the Shell, and we have this sort of this girl who's out there trying to figure out who it is that's dismembering other sort of girls, and it's it's specified in this. It's not just cyborgs; they're there just going around sort of randomly killing girls.
Right.
So I mean, yeah, you're right. They're basically just. I kind of felt it was just they're trying to sort of portray a world that's just very dangerous and just in quite a nightmarish technological way, really.
Yeah, and so that's even more where Dr. Ito is this father figure, right? Where as a dad, different times you're trying to protect your little girl and trying to keep her like safe and stuff like that. And it's a sense of like okay, despite how much you may try to do that, there's only so much you can do. Like besides kind of giving guidance and say, hey, don't stay out late, come back, like kind of before it gets dark or too dark and stuff like that.
Don't fight large cybernetic killers in the sewers. That's what I say to my daughter all the time. But yeah, I mean, there's also a very sort of twisted angle on that as well, and that she isn't really his daughter. He's just kind of randomly picked up this corpse from a garbage thing and decided to make it into his daughter, which is also a bit strange. And I mean, there's no explicit connection with any kind of family that he had in the anime, but yeah, they sort of try and fit in the psychological gap in the remake. But I mean, ultimately he's there kind of it's a physical representation of him manipulating her, in that he's basically piecing her together and repairing her and doing stuff like this. But it's a kind of I guess a sort of analogy for psychological manipulation, perhaps.
Well, at one point like he or she's kind of questions him, like what am I, some kind of doll for you to play with and stuff. And the funny part is that like when you look at her physically and also like kind of her voice and stuff like that, she's very much like a doll. Like that's the ironic part, that like it's like I mean granted to some degree like he made her that way, but to another degree it's also like kind of like, well, look at you, kind of you do look like a doll, you do sound like a doll and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we should necessarily shy away from the fact that there is a certain sort of male readership that is going to kind of get off on that, and this idea of like having a sort of weirdly submissive female that can be taken apart and put back together again, but is also, interestingly enough, also incredibly powerful and also a warrior as well. So it's an interesting kind of contrast with the character there a little bit. But I mean, she does wear pretty figure hugging clothes all the time in the manga and the anime. So I mean, there's obviously a bit of that that's going on there too.
Yeah, and that's like kind of this weird, and it's something maybe you're more familiar with. But I kind of different times, like when I see stuff like that, on the one hand, it's clearly representative of, like you said, the readership and also kind of the taste and the aesthetic and stuff like that. But to another degree, it's a weird juxtaposition, like, because on the one hand, it is kind of this cutesy, vocally and visually stuff like that. But on the other, like you said, she's this powerful kind of, cyborg that like, becomes a hunter warrior, kind of, and I guess, sometimes we've even seen that in Westerns, like kind of like where that like this kind of thing that something's not what it's, some things can be deceptive. It's not really what it looks to be and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's other animes that do it in a much more extreme way. I mean, there's one called Elfen Lied, which is about sort of a race of sort of elves, and there's a very sort of cutesy looking sort of elf thing who then sort of when she sort of is in danger, sort of turns sort of completely psychotic and just kills absolutely everything in her path, instantly. So yeah, it's not an uncommon theme in anime by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, definitely one of the more striking moments was like kind of attack that she's having and stuff, and then like as soon as she stops, it's kind of like a switch. She kind of goes back to her kind of cutesy voice, kind of like she goes from this kind of like kind of screaming, kind of this banshee that kind of is like something out of some hellish landscape and stuff. And
there's a lot of screaming in the OVA, yeah.
And then the next second she sort of, oh, okay. Kind of she goes back to this kind of the docile, kind of doll-like voice.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? But I mean, it's Yugo's kind of I think he's more interesting in the OVA than he is in the movie, because he's this very innocent, sort of appearingly kind of very cute little boy.
Yeah.
But he spends his night cutting the spines and brains out of people with his street gang and selling them, all for his one person of getting, his one aim of getting to Zolom, supposed better life. And it's his obsession in a way that's quite sort of tragic in this. It's not sort of, it is pretty tragic in that, he's there sort of, he ends up kind of basically sacrificing any kind of ethical or moral life.
It's very much.
Then he, sorry, someone just came out there. Yeah, and he's completely obsessed to the point where he sacrifices not only his entire physical body, but also kind of his personal safety and really his relationship with Alita as well, just to sort of attain this ideal of getting to Zolom.
It's kind of similar theme that I feel like now it's kind of more, not about commonplace, but it's kind of we've seen it a lot more, kind of with Breaking Bad, kind of where how far do you go for your goals, that like and to what point, like kind of a price of your own safety and like those around you and stuff like that like is there a line, and when do you cross it and stuff.
Yeah, and I mean it's I have a sort of a slightly OCD nature to myself, and it's interesting that when you get a particular kind of obsessive goal in your mind, you tend to kind of compartmentalize that, and everything else becomes sort of periphery to the main thing. And so it's kind of like this thing of, I will learn to do karate, but then I'll also just kind of to protect myself, but then you kind of like you snap all your tendons and when you're practicing it, so you're kind of it's one of those things that doesn't, it starts to not make sense necessarily.
Yeah, I think on a meta level it definitely is similar to Disney as both the entity and also like kind of the world it's created, because like on the one hand you had this kind of Main Street USA kind of where life as Walt kind of imagined it to be, like kind of in this kind of fictionalized theme park and stuff like that. But meanwhile, like I don't know if you've heard the stories with like kind of employees like kind of like practically almost suffocating in the costumes and stuff like that, like that like, but meanwhile they're not supposed to like ever break out of character, kind of so it's like kind of, I feel like it's like that's like a little bit of what is almost even in a weird way kind of in a real world level representative, like kind of this kind of weird dichotomy of like like how far do you go to kind of present this image like kind of versus what the reality is and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I mean, in some respects, it's kind of, there's some level of admiration that you kind of have for people with this kind of psychotic obsession to preserve this kind of image. It's, you almost have to, it's a weird sort of admiration, but the fact that you can go there and it's so sort of clean cut and everything is exactly as, there's something sort of weirdly fetishistic about that, of seeing a completely maniacal corporation trying to do that.
And I think that's the funny part too, is that like really in some ways that's kind of what Zom represents too, that like here's this world that we don't ever see, but you can just imagine that like it's kind of like like kind of this Disney-esque perfection and stuff, where like you don't have to deal with the consequences of dumping your trash on this other scrap iron city and stuff like that.
Yeah, Zolom is the Disney to the to the Iron City, which is the rest of Florida, I guess, or well, maybe not California, I suppose. But yeah, I did see there's a news story recently, isn't there, about sort of in Anaheim. There was some corruption
Oh, really?
story involving
Uh-huh.
Disney and Anaheim. Apparently, I have not really read into it, but yeah,
Okay.
yeah, the trash is starting to pile up. Yeah, so I guess in terms of the OVA, it's as I say, it's very stylistic because it's anime, and it's always very difficult to sort of portray that in a live action. But I mean, that's really some of the main thing. We've got some fighting, and we have this rather sort of innocent love story set against a backdrop of a very interesting kind of dystopian future. But ultimately, it's quite simple, I would say, compared to the film. I don't know if you had any more thoughts on the original
Just
anime.
that we touched on the darknesses and stuff. It really
Yeah.
doesn't hold back, and kind of just like, like there's a bit of sex, like kind of, so it's not definitely not a animation for children and stuff like that. And then there's
No.
and there's a bit of graphic violence too, like
Oh
where,
yeah.
kind of like you said about the spines, and like kind of
People getting sliced up and things like
yeah,
this.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean that's quite a sort of brutal scene where Yugo just gets completely sliced up, and Alita tries to sort of desperately piece him back together in some way. Oddly enough, though, I found the remake creepier. But yes.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I guess there's also this. I mean, there's obviously the sort of empowerment angle as well, in that you have a girl who's sort of rejecting everything that her father figure kind of puts towards her and says, just be quiet and safe. And she says, like, no, I want to go and sort of fight massive
Right.
cybernetic warriors. So, get out of my way, pops. I'm going to go and do this. So, but I mean, I'm sure that there's obviously much more interesting and complicated themes, I guess, over the stretch of all of the manga that isn't really, we're only seeing a very small slice of it in the original OVA. But yeah, it's an interesting one. Obviously, captured a lot of people's imagination. So, but yeah, it's interesting to see a completely kind of transhumanist dystopia, sort of actually in a story like that.
You kind of mentioned, this is definitely something that James Cameron had his back pocket for quite a while. I kind of forgot about it, but like I remember in the early 2000s, he had actually developed the television series called Dark Angel, which was, pretty much you can clearly see the influence of it. So I feel like it's in a lot of ways, he has had to, or he has wanted to kind of do this. And then meanwhile, I guess along the ways, Robert Rodriguez was being also a fanboy, kind of kept asking him, hey, what are you going to do with that? Kind of, because apparently, Cameron has had the rights. And then finally, like, I guess Cameron, maybe just to get him off his back, said, well, if you want to do it, you write it and kind of, make it happen. So,
yeah, I think it's kind of ironic because when we were talking about Conan, I kind of said, the problem with the remake is they should have got someone like Robert Rodriguez to do it, and he would have like knocked it out of the park, no question. And here we have, obviously James Cameron thought exactly the same way, and but it didn't unfortunately pan out quite as he hoped. But yeah, I mean it's an interesting one because it's got a good cast. I mean, I think you got Ed Skrein and Rosa Salazar. I mean, I think that's this is one of those weird things where with Rosa Salazar, we're basically watching a CGI character for the whole movie. Now, you could sort of, from a more abstracted level, kind of say, well, that's part of the point of the movie is that, you have a completely kind of transformed human that is nothing more than a brain. So the rest of it is fake, essentially. And we're supposed to still be able to sort of follow this protagonist, and that's part of the point of the world they've created. But on the other side, it's kind of hard to really identify with the CGI image rather than the human character. It's
it's interesting you said that, and that was like the thing that I had to admit I struggled with, like kind of compared to Ghost in the Shell, we had Scarlett Johansson who acted robotic and stuff. Here you had a CGI character acting human,
Well,
and
acting was sort of very, actually more than human, really, sort of like real kind of emotionalism, sort of heart on your sleeve kind of, which is kind of actually in
yeah,
keeping in the spirit of anime, because anime is very kind of over the top in its kind of emotiveness. So it was kind of
right.
interesting in a way.
And that's the thing though, that like the bottom question or bottom line question is does it work and stuff. And I have to admit that like I asked myself that quite a bit and everything, and then I found that like it was more distracting than than
Mm,
helpful, to have her be this kind of in this uncanny valley kind of way and stuff like that.
yeah, and it's not for lack of trying. I mean, they've definitely they've put a lot of detail and thought
Hmm.
into this kind of cyborg future. And they go, and there's a lot of visual detail into portraying the different warrior hunters, and the mechanics of how you would be able to dismember parts, put them back together, and even the fight scenes are pretty violent, and they don't sort of pull any punches in that respect.
No.
It keeps a lot of the original sort of spirit of the original manga and anime in that respect. And I mean, of course, and then they do add in a lot of other elements, I think most of which are from the manga. The idea of the kind of the Martian war, and you're learning that she's actually part of that. I think that is, as I say, I wish I'd say I'd read all 6 volumes of the manga, but I haven't. But from what I've read of other people talking about it, it seems that is. I mean, the inclusion of Shiren and Ido's sort of dead daughter, isn't it,
Mm.
is something they've added for the movie.
Hmm.
But it does, I mean, it does kind of make sense as to why they would why he would be looking for a surrogate sort of daughter, and would have sort of picked up on Alita. And I guess it also kind of in Shiren's character, in that she's so sort of bitter towards him, is like, well, maybe she's sort of somewhat jealous of this weird replacement daughter that he's to some degree sort of pieced together. But then again, Jennifer Connelly isn't quite as sort of, she doesn't portray that kind of overt jealousy that the OVA character does.
Mm.
And I kind of, because I guess they wanted to make her a little more intelligent and less one-dimensional, perhaps.
Mm.
Yeah.
She definitely, like, I feel like that's what we certainly talked about her and Snowpiercer and stuff, and the thing that she really does portray well is these intelligent women that may have like kind of some kind of tragic flaw and stuff like that. That doesn't quite play that character in Top Gun and stuff, but she definitely that's kind of become her niche and stuff like that. That like these intelligent women that like kind of you really feel like there's something kind of going on and stuff like that. For good and bad and everything. And
yeah, definitely who sort of exists in a sort of moral gray area a little bit.
yes.
Yeah, that's kind of her thing, isn't it? Yeah, and we have a very fleeting view of Ed Norton as Nova in this, as the big bad guy who doesn't really get a look in.
And that's the thing I do want to say, like, real quickly, is that like we I feel like we spent all this time before like there's this reveal who's the ultimate kind of villain, like kind of like that, and then we never even get to it. And I guess the point was that like, okay, this was supposed to be like leading to a sequel and stuff that unfortunately may or may not ever get made and everything.
Yeah, it was a bit too kind of heavy-handed in that. Yeah, we should make a sequel to this, but I mean, at least with the original OVA, they don't even focus on that at all. It's more just about sort of Hugo's attempt to get there. But yeah, it's but they do pan out the world quite a lot. You do learn about somewhat about how Zolan works, and how it came to be that it's the last floating city and things like this, and that there's she has some sort of core power that's far more powerful than any cyborg that's around, and the whole sequence where she goes and finds this Martian cruiser and kind of instinctually kind of navigate it. And I mean, it's quite intriguing, the world they exist, and you see all the flashbacks of the battle and things like this. It's and the motorball sequences are all visually done very well, I thought. It's very kind of, reminded me a lot of Speed Racer in that respect, in that you kind of focused on a race as the main kind of visual spectacle of the movie.
Well, the whole thing too with motorball though reminded me so much of like rollerball that we talked about stuff. I mean that was clear. Like kind of we're and I think the a lot of those things are all fine stuff. I think the biggest flaw I feel like is the fact that like our early question of like how much of it is fan service and stuff, and where she has like kind of these Disney princess doe-like eyes that like basically where like right away she's like everything is like kind of like, oh, it's wonderful, my name's Alita, oh that's wonderful, like kind of like that, like there's this kind of like you kind of like feel like there's nothing that you can throw at her that would ever really get her down and stuff like that.
And I mean, that's fine. And that's part of, like we said, that's what makes the OVA work, is because you have this horrible dark backdrop that this sort of naive kind of optimism is contrasted with this. In this, it kind of seems like the society, there isn't a killer on the loose. Hugo is not, he's not killing people in his spare time. He's just kind of chopping their arms off, which is a bit, it's just to make him a bit,
mechanical arms, in all fairness.
Yeah, and I mean, they try and make him too nice, really. I think in a way, I think it's more interesting having Hugo as a younger character, maybe not quite so buff as well, and as someone who's in his spare time killing people for his secret obsession, and more of that. I guess there's more of that in the anime, that he is working directly for Vector, and there is no kind of redemption bit where he says, okay, enough of this, I don't want to do this anymore. And they really try and make him much more likable in the fact that he tries to persuade his friends not to do it. And
but I think for me, like it's the fact that like that sometimes that the uncanny valley falls into her willingness to kind of just to give everything right away and stuff like that. They're like, because like literally that one part where she's like, you want my heart here, like kind of like it's more than even like kind of creepy. It's kind of like a little bit like kind of like just a little too much, kind of where I understand that she's this innocent battle angel and stuff like that. Like that's partially kind of the whole idea, is that like she has this innocence and everything, and I think the other part was like kind of like, I don't know. It just seems like we're kind of struggling with two different things. On one hand, she's this kind of killing machine and stuff like that, and the other, she's like kind of like kind of this Frankenstein awakening innocence that like where she doesn't really know right from wrong yet and everything, that she hasn't been tainted by the corrupt world and stuff.
Well, I think they definitely tried to make it much more of a kind of a teenage coming of age movie than the anime, and that that there's much more focus on. It's funny, there's more focus on her relationship with Hugo, and and I mean, I'm sure if you've fallen in love as a teenager, it does feel like you're maybe ripping your heart out and giving it to someone else. But it's a very interesting visual metaphor, and I didn't really hate that per se. As I say, for me, it was more the fact that it was just very hard to. I just didn't sort of get much out of their relationship, and it was spending a lot of time trying to do that, unfortunately, and for whatever reason. I think one of the main problems with it really is that the script wasn't very good, really. A lot of the time, the dialogue's just a bit flat. It's very flashy visually. I mean, you could say the same thing about anime, really, in that it's more style over dialogue a lot of the time. But I think there's something about, I don't know what it is. We're willing to sort of suspend our belief a little bit more when we're watching an animation than we are a live action thing.
That's what I was saying, like from Ghost in the Shell, that like there's something that happens with us that I feel like it's a little bit of like kind of the subconscious thing where when we see something that's anime or animated, we kind of like almost our childlike receptors, kind of are activated, and we're kind of more willing to kind of go with it and stuff. And then when we see something live action, um, then there's this kind of different expectation. That's kind of
Yeah.
like more like, okay, convince me.
Yeah, and there's a sort of a level of abstraction as well, in that it's, for some reason, it's more easier to accept far more outlandish kind of abstract story elements in an animation than it is in live
Yes.
action. And it's interesting. So when you have kids and things like this, you watch
Huh.
them. You can see animated violence, and
Mhm.
it doesn't have them, or animated sort of horror in a way. It doesn't affect them that much because there's that level
Uh-huh.
of abstraction. Whereas you put a
Mm.
real horror movie on, it's like they're ducking behind the sofa. So
Mm.
it's like, it allows us to process things slightly different when it's animated for some reason.
Definitely.
But yeah, I mean, I think the other um, big thing in this that is much more on the nose
Mhm.
is this kind of idea that we talked about briefly with Robocop, is this idea of, a connection with a kind of a transgender theme,
Mm.
in that in Robocop we talked about, this is a man with his family who undergoes a sort of a bodily transformation and has
Right.
to sort of come to grips with his new kind of body. And I mean, in this one, you've got a girl who's been basically given a body by her parents, which she
Oh,
then kind of rejects, and then
yes.
goes and finds her own body, which then subconsciously kind of engineers itself to her image of how she views herself, which I thought was a very, for me, I don't think it gets more on the nose than that. In that there's a sort of transgender
Yeah,
sub
yeah.
thing in this, and there's also the dialogue between her and Hugo, where his friend is saying, or his partner, I should say, because they're not particularly friendly. But the way he says, it doesn't bother you that she's a hard body, in that
Mm.
she has a sort of a robotic body, and he's like, no. So I mean, again, it's this kind of thing where we have a society where there's people who are almost not even human to the point of changing themselves, or in
Mm.
various different degrees in between, and it's just kind of accepted that that's just normal life. So in a way, it's odd. Whereas the anime created it was very much a more dystopian feel. I almost
Mhm.
feel like this is a weird kind of utopian vision of something where you
Mhm.
can augment your body any way you want, and anyone
Mhm.
just accepts it, because it doesn't seem quite as dark as the original anime's society, I would say.
Well, even like the opening sequences, right, where even like the where Dr. Ito, originally finds her, it's like kind of like we see this sunlit backdrop, and then like as she wakes up, there's kind of sunlight coming through the window, and then like kind of we go into this kind of sunlit city that kind of reminds me of like kind of maybe some Latin American kind of locale and stuff like that. So I feel like it's, yeah, definitely. I don't know, like maybe partially that's what the aesthetic that Robert Rodriguez was going for, like kind of something that
Mm.
was very much like kind of like an Encanto kind of scene and everything. But we definitely have stepped away from the kind of cyberpunk Blade Runner esque
Yeah,
world and stuff like that.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, yes, it's definitely not in the same vein in that respect. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to see that the same characters get augmented several times as well. Like
Mm.
Grushka goes from, he gets upgraded as we go along, and but I mean, for me, actually, the one of the most sort of interesting elements was the idea that rather than, as in Robocop, you've got this evil corporation overseeing everything, and this you have sort of one man, Nova, who has
Mm.
this, he has sort of basically control over people's very biology. In that, if you work for him, he can basically
Oh,
take
right.
over your conscious mind at any given moment, whenever he
Yeah.
feels like. And what I thought is really creepy is the that's why I say actually what I quite liked about this version was it got creepier as the movie went along,
Hmm.
in that whereas the anime is very dark from the beginning,
Mhm.
this kind of gets more insidious as you go on, because right towards the end you have Vector, who in his dying moments
Mm.
has, his consciousness is completely controlled right to the moment of death, which I thought was a very
Mhm.
dark kind of concept. And then you have Shiren, who's also wants to return to Zolom, but can only go back as a brain stem and a heart and some
I was wondering whether they
it.
were going to keep that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was quite impressed that they did. I mean, in many respects, it's very faithful to the original. There's just some tonal changes and as I say, some other bits that are different. But yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, this idea that basically he could at any point see through the eyes of any of his minions to see what's going on. It's yeah.
And that's kind of like something, again, we had in Westworld, where like kind of, you know, at any given moment, you know, like somebody's consciousness could be taken over by, you know, kind of this other consciousness, I guess, and stuff.
Yeah, and you wonder if that sort of that extends to any of the sort of robotic parts that people are replaced with, and by Alita going and finding this, you know, this old Martian one, she basically can exist outside of the society. But yeah, it's a very kind of insidious thing of like, you know, not only do you give up your parts of your body to attain certain goals, but you basically have subjected your part of your conscious mind to the society as well. I mean, you could say we do that already, you know, but it's yeah, much more graphically represented in this one. So.
Definitely, and that's like a interesting kind of question of the price of, you know, kind of augmentation, kind of this world where, like, you know, like you said, that like it's just taking for granted that like, oh, you know, kind of, yeah, you gotta want to replace your arm, no problem, you know, kind of it is kind of an interesting question of like what's the, you know, like kind of what hidden costs will there be in the future and stuff.
Yeah, but it's a very different. I mean, I remember when we watched the RoboCop remake, and you see after the accident, there's very little of him left, and they really accurately portray that complete shock and sort of you know, tragic kind of realization that there's nothing of him left. And in this, it's like people are just happy just to be like a brain and a head, and the rest of them is it's not even, it's, you know, no even second thought. It's just like, oh, you got crushed by a massive spider centurion, we'll just replace your entire body and you're just like a head on top of a robot now. It's no worries. But I did find it creepy, the fact that she was, I mean, it's an interesting visual metaphor that she's keeping Hugo alive by just, you know, her heart is like literally there pumping blood into his dismembered head.
Yes,
it's one of those things that like, it's a clever trick, but it's also really, really creepy. I thought that was actually really fun. And there's lots of bits like that in this that I think are really good. The problem is I just didn't care about her and Hugo's relationship at all.
Yeah,
for whatever reason, unfortunately. But I mean, the rest of it is, as I say, it's quite well paced. There's lots of action. It's visually very interesting. It's the sort of movie that when you get a new TV, it's great to stick on. Yeah. So you can sort of watch some things, my candy, but yeah, not one that I would be reaching for, you know, down the line as a classic, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think that's it. Just you know, it's we have to like care about the main characters, you know, regardless of how visually it's, you know, kind of appealing and stuff like that. And that's something that, like, you know, for whatever reason they just fall short on. And I agree, like kind of, you know, I think part of it, to be honest, you know, like kind of I think is just really you know, Hugo, like kind of where he starts off kind of being, you know, kind of like you said, a very typical kind of young romance and stuff like that. But then, you know, towards the end, he's just whining all the time. He's kind of like, oh, save me, kind of, you know, like he just kind of just, you know, and you almost like don't really like you don't feel like the same sympathy as you do with the original Hugo, that, like, you know, it does seem kind of pretty tragic. Major spoiler as always, you know, as he's kind of like falling away, you know, kind of, you know, it does have kind of like that Titanic kind of thing of like, you know, Leonardo being let go and stuff like that. But in this one, it's kind of like, okay.
Makes you wonder, is maybe that's where Cameron got the end of Titanic from. Maybe it's all just Battle Angel Alita and just reinvented. Yeah. No, but I will say this much, in terms of fleshing out an anime world, you know, that's several hundred years in the future where everything is cybernetic. It does a much better job than Ghost in the Shell, I thought, in terms of, you know, bringing that to life.
For sure.
Yeah. So it's in that respect, it's it's a good adaptation, I would say, but maybe not overall a good movie in a way, as we were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah, I feel like they do, overall, like, I mean, it's impressive work. They did a really, bang up job visually, stuff like that, but just, story wise, and also like kind of just the development of, the romance and stuff like that. It just kind of, just that's where it's lacking and stuff. I think the motorball, it's kind of exciting. Again, it's just, all the stuff that's like visually, like is kind of satisfying and stuff like that. Like you kind of like, you just, like you said, with a brand new TV, you just couldn't, stop, kind of keeping it in the backdrop and kind of, it's great, eye candy and stuff. But, like in terms of just if you were sitting through it and kind of like, I mean, I feel like, this is one of those movies that like you probably can only sit through it so many times and stuff.
Yeah. But once was, I mean, I watched it twice now in my life, and I feel like I'm already like over the general quota for the time that I've been alive. So I'll give it another go in another 20 years or so, and I'll see how I feel.
I think one thing that I did find interesting was that Christoph Waltz, we definitely, tend to like think of him as a villain, and I feel like that's one thing they kind of capitalize on, of where the initial question of whether he's the killer and stuff like that, they did kind of like disguise that well, because like, again, with the thing we talked about different times, the shorthand stuff, like typically he's a shorthand of being this kind of, psycho, kind of guy and stuff like that. But in this one, I don't know, like I bought him as kind of like this tragic kind of doctor that, wants, wishes he had his daughter back. I bought it anyways.
Yeah. I mean, he did a serviceable job. As I say, there isn't really enough time to flesh out his character in great detail. But yeah, you're right, actually. I mean, I totally forgot there is a killer on the loose, and they do sort of mention that in the movie, don't they? It just doesn't have the same kind of dark impact for some reason. But yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Yeah, I didn't know if they were going to try and introduce some other kind of darker tone to his character, which is why they cast him. But I think it was probably just more a case of, we can get a good actor in, so let's do it. But yeah, it makes you wonder what this must be one of those things where on paper, as an actor, you must sign up for this and just think, yeah, man, sure, this is going to be great. How could this possibly go wrong? James Cameron, Robert Rodriguez, lots of other good actors.
Yeah.
Classic kind of, futuristic sci-fi story. Yeah.
And like financially, it did all right. I mean, it doubled its budget, the box office stuff, which, it's not a by any means considered a runaway success, but it's also not like totally a bomb either. So like, so it's kind of like, so I feel like, overall, it's kind of like, it just similar to our overall opinion. It does a serviceable job. It's like it's something that like it's not a bomb, but it's at the same time, like a sequel in the works. I don't know. I think my prediction is that like there's a lot that they have to overcome to, convince the studios to kind of finance that.
But to be fair, James Cameron can be very persistent, as seen by the sequel to Avatar coming out this year.
That's true.
Which has been a long time, and it makes you wonder why. I mean, that was obviously much, much more successful in terms of returns, but makes you wonder what maybe it was just his choice to take so long over a sequel, or decided there was something that really I'm going to be interested to watch Avatar 2 to see what it is that he actually felt was important enough in this period of time to make a Pocahontas 2 effectively. So
well, I mean, from the bits that I've seen so far, like I don't feel like it like the leap that it made at the time visually, that Avatar made, for everything else in that territory, it's it's clear and stuff like that. But now, like it seems like it's
less obvious.
It seems like
that's kind of what's piqued my interest about it. Because I wonder, okay, everything can be CGI from, grain of sand to the sun now. So what can they actually do that's going to be interesting? I think, I mean, from what I can see, it's about their kids, the sort of human, whatever they're called, Pandoran kids. And I mean, I think it's going to be a kind of I'm just guessing. This is a very blunt sort of approximation of it, but it's going to be kind of, I don't know, maybe some comment on interracial kids or something like this, or cross, cultural relationships or something like that. And I'm just really taking a very kind of generalistic stab in the dark there. But we'll see. Maybe I'll be surprised by it.
Yeah, but I think that's a great point, though. It's like kind of what besides that, what is there really that to kind of delve into and stuff like that. And
it makes you could say the same thing about Top Gun Maverick. You just say, wow, we did what could they possibly bring, and like but I don't. So yes, and we'll do that, I'm sure, in an episode coming up soon. We'll do. I mean, should we do that? I mean, the thing is, though, it's not actually a remake, though, is it?
It isn't.
Kind of a.
I mean, we can almost like just say it, treat it as that, as like not a remake episode.
Right. just something we wanted to talk about anyway.
Because it's one of those movies that could have gone that way. It could have been, and that was the discussion, was like between doing a sequel and a remake. That was like kind of for years, like kind of the question of like, will they kind of do a remake or will they do like a sequel and stuff like that? And of course, that's what they ultimately answered, that like, and I feel like in some ways they did a little of both, like kind of honestly. So that's kind of like what they really achieved with it as well, because even though it is technically a sequel, because it's the storyline follows afterwards, but there's a lot of things with it that like you kind of see that like it's both homage, but also like kind of where it's not as on the nose as like the let's call it the Force Awakens of being basically
the same movie.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that's what's interesting, is to see the reception of these kind of sequels that take a lot of the original elements and the original actors and set them sometime later. They're much more successful than them trying to kind of recast things and redo them. That only works on TV. It seems like if they sort of have an interesting idea and they flesh it out on the TV series on Netflix, well, that's one thing. But in the movies, well, I would say, Cobra Kai and probably this are good examples of stuff where actually involving the original actors is much more successful. It just shows you how much the original actors really bring to the table when they're doing these original classics.
I think it's that, and also at the same time, just kind of like anime, that like when we have a different expectation for the small screen, that like that like when we watch something on television, we there's some kind of, I don't know, like I think that's the thing I had to think about, like kind of what is the different expectation stuff. But I feel like it, one is that like we can definitely, the obvious ones, we can stretch out the story, like kind of, and it won't be tedious, because this is kind of sense that like, okay, we have an expectation of episodes and stuff, so that gives the creators much more room and stuff to explore the world. And I feel like that's, maybe in the past, like kind of a luxury that just wasn't ever really expected, or not kind of, just given and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, where that works, like we said, with things like The Mandalorian, is when you add some sort of depth to that world, it's much more interesting. But if you don't, then it just becomes fairly tedious. But yeah, it's an opportunity to explore the world in more detail. But you're right, there's a different expectation. I think with a movie, you kind of expect a much more kind of, I guess it's something, you can look at it like frequency, like a chart. With TV, you can kind of expect little peaks and troughs of drama and expectation played around with. But with a movie, you kind of want like a dramatic kind of peak and a, normally a trough and then a sort of peak at the end. So I think it's just a bigger amplitude of drama you expect in a movie,
right?
And ideas and various other things. Yeah,
definitely. Anyway. So with that, we'll still working our way towards Death Note, and trying to remember the other ones, Firestarter.
Yeah, Firestarter, we'll get that in soon. And then if we want to do more anime, I do think Attack on Titan will be
Yes,
an
yes.
interesting one to do.
Attack on Titan, yeah.
And I think maybe to round it off, Fist of the North Star, just because it'll be a rollicking good time.
Definitely. So once again,
Okay.
I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we will see you at the movies.